My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and my parents charged me $2,000 a month to sleep in my own childhood twin bed. They claimed they were teaching me financial responsibility, while my older brother lived downstairs entirely for free. When I finally asked them why I was funding his lifestyle, my mother called me ungrateful in front of 10 relatives. I did not scream or cry. I simply packed my bags and left. 30 days later, my parents learned a devastating truth about the very house they kicked me out of, and my mother called me 24 times in a single night. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with toxic family favoritism. Growing up in an affluent suburb of Chicago meant that appearances were everything to my parents. Linda and Thomas cared more about what the neighbors thought than what was actually happening under their own roof. Our house was a sprawling brick colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and tall windows that always had to be sparkling clean. Inside the house was cold and full of impossible expectations. My mother demanded perfection from me while my older brother Blake could do no wrong. I was expected to get straight grades, earn scholarships, and secure a high-paying corporate job. Blake was allowed to find himself, which usually meant quitting jobs and moving back home whenever things got difficult. I managed to escape their constant judgment by working incredibly hard. I climbed the corporate ladder in the supply chain industry, working 60-hour weeks and saving every penny I could. My dedication paid off, and I finally purchased a beautiful condo in the city. It was my sanctuary. Unfortunately, the building required mandatory structural renovations to the plumbing and electrical systems. The condo association informed me that I would have to vacate my unit for exactly 3 months, while the crews tore up the floors and walls. Finding a short-term rental in Chicago that allowed for a flexible month-to-month lease was proving to be a nightmare, and the prices were astronomical. During a weekly phone call, my mother offered a solution that seemed practical at the time. She told me I could move back into my old childhood bedroom. It would only be for 3 months, she reasoned, and it would give us a chance to spend some quality family time together. Against my better judgment, I packed 2 large suitcases and drove out to the suburbs. I should have known that my parents never offered anything without a catch. The trap snapped shut on my very first night back in the house. We were sitting around the large mahogany dining table finishing a dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables. I was expressing my gratitude for their hospitality when my father cleared his throat. He put his fork down and folded his hands on the table, looking at me with his familiar stern expression. He said that since I was a successful professional making a good salary, it was only right that I pull my own weight. I agreed completely, assuming he meant I should buy my own groceries and maybe pay a portion of the utility bills. Then my mother dropped the bombshell. She smiled her tight, polite smile and said they expected $2,000 a month for rent and utilities. I nearly choked on my water. $2,000 a month to sleep in a twin bed in a room that had not been updated since I was in high school. I stared at them in absolute shock. I pointed out that $2,000 was almost what I paid for my mortgage in the city. My father immediately grew defensive. He told me that they were not running a charity and that maintaining a large suburban house was expensive. He said I was using their electricity, their water, and their space. I felt a familiar wave of anxiety wash over me. My parents had always been experts at making me feel guilty for existing. They spun the narrative to make it sound like they were doing me a massive favor and that my hesitation was a sign of extreme selfishness. I was exhausted from the move and deeply stressed about the renovations at my condo. I did not have the energy to fight a battle I knew I would lose. To keep the peace, I swallowed my pride and agreed to their absurd demand. The very next morning, I set up an automatic bank transfer to send them $2,000 on the first of every month. I told myself I just needed to survive the next 90 days. The true cruelty of my parents' demand became apparent the longer I stayed in the house. You see, I was not their only child living under that roof. My older brother Blake had moved back home 2 years prior. Blake was 35 years old and the undisputed golden child of the family. While I was paying premium city rent prices for a faded room with a squeaky twin bed, Blake was living in the fully renovated basement suite. The basement was practically a luxury apartment. My parents had spent tens of thousands of dollars outfitting it with a home theater system, a wet bar, a massive sectional sofa, and a king-sized bed. It had its own private entrance and a luxurious bathroom with a walk-in shower. Blake lived there like a king. And the most infuriating part was that he paid absolutely nothing. $0 for rent, $0 for utilities, $0 for groceries. Blake called himself an entrepreneur, but I had never actually seen him work. His entire career consisted of chasing get-rich-quick schemes. One month, he was launching a drop-shipping business that failed before it even started. The next month, he was a day trader, supposedly making thousands in cryptocurrency, but constantly needing to borrow money for gas. He slept until noon every single day. He spent his afternoons playing video games on his massive television and his evenings going out to expensive bars with his friends. The contrast between our lives was maddening. I woke up at 6 in the morning, logged onto my laptop, and worked grueling 10-hour shifts, managing global supply chains. I took conference calls from my tiny childhood desk, trying to sound professional, while Blake blasted loud music from the basement. I bought my own groceries and cooked my own meals because my mother claimed she was too tired to cook for everyone. Yet every evening I watched her carefully prepare a plate of hot food and carry it down the basement stairs for Blake. She even did his laundry washing and folding his clothes while telling me I was using too much hot water when I washed my own. The crowning jewel of Blake's entitled lifestyle sat right in my parents' driveway. It was a brand new leased Porsche SUV. Blake claimed he needed a luxury vehicle to project success to potential investors. Since he had no verifiable income, my father had co-signed the lease and was paying the monthly premiums. Meanwhile, I had to park my practical sedan on the street because Blake insisted his Porsche needed the safety of the driveway. Every time I walked past that expensive car to get to my own vehicle, my blood boiled. Whenever I dared to gently bring up the disparity, my parents would immediately shut me down. My mother would say that Blake was in a transitional phase and needed support to reach his full potential. She argued that because I was doing so well in the corporate world, I could afford to be generous. My father would chime in, adding that Blake was building an empire and that true entrepreneurship took time and capital. They treated my steady, reliable career as something ordinary and uninspiring, while treating Blake's lazy delusions as brilliant visions of the future. I watched my $2,000 transfers clear my bank account each month with growing resentment. I was essentially funding my brother's luxury lifestyle. My hard-earned money was going into my parents' pockets only to be funneled directly into Blake's car payments, his premium cable packages, and his expensive takeout meals. I was working myself to the bone to subsidize a 35-year-old man who refused to grow up. The injustice of it kept me awake at night. I lay in my uncomfortable twin bed staring at the glowing glow in the dark stars I had stuck to the ceiling when I was 12 years old. I listened to the muffled sounds of action movies vibrating through the floorboards from Blake's incredible sound system. I realized that my family did not view me as a daughter to be cherished. They viewed me as a resource to be exploited. I was the reliable workhorse meant to pull the cart, while Blake was the show pony who got all the treats and applause. I kept my head down and counted the days until my condo would be ready. I told myself I just needed to endure this toxic environment a little longer. I tried to stay out of their way, spending my weekends at coffee shops or working extra hours just to avoid the tension in the house. But the tension was a living, breathing thing in that home, and it was building toward a massive breaking point. My parents had pushed me into a corner, demanding my money while showing me absolute disrespect. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient daughter who would always follow their rules. They had no idea that their greed was about to trigger a chain of events that would destroy their perfect suburban facade forever. The breaking point was coming, and it would happen in front of an audience. The breaking point finally arrived on the fourth Saturday of my stay. My parents hosted one of their grand family dinners. This was not just a casual get-together with paper plates and a barbecue. It was a highly orchestrated performance designed to showcase their suburban success. My mother spent the entire week preparing the house. She hired a professional cleaning service, bought expensive floral arrangements for the entryway, and ordered premium catering from a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. She invited my Aunt Patricia and Uncle Greg, along with several other extended relatives, who loved to bask in my parents' perceived wealth. I knew perfectly well that my $2,000 rent payment had heavily subsidized the expensive prime rib, the imported cheeses, and the cases of reserve wine they were serving. I sat near the far end of the long dining table, quietly eating my salad and observing the spectacle. The room was loud with booming laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. Aunt Patricia was wearing a new diamond necklace and loudly bragging about her latest luxury vacation to the Bahamas. Uncle Greg was dominating the conversation on his side of the table, discussing his golf handicap and his new country club membership. But as always, the true center of attention was Blake. He sat at the opposite end of the table, right next to my father, holding a glass of expensive bourbon like a king holding court. He wore a crisp linen shirt and an arrogant, confident smile that never seemed to leave his face. My parents looked at him as if he were a genius who had just cured a major disease. Throughout the first two courses, I barely spoke a word. I listened to my relatives ask Blake detailed questions about his latest ventures. They never asked about my job. They never asked how my condo renovations were going or how I was handling the stress of displacement. Whenever the conversation accidentally drifted toward me, my mother would quickly steer it back to Blake or complain about how city living was making me cynical and difficult to be around. I kept my head down, chewed my food, and focused on getting through the evening without starting an argument. But Blake was clearly eager for the spotlight, and he was ready to put on a massive show for his adoring audience. As the caterers cleared the heavy dinner plates and brought out silver trays of dessert, Blake tapped his spoon against his wine glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut cleanly through the chatter. Everyone at the table immediately fell silent and turned their eager attention to him. My mother beamed, clasping her hands tightly together under her chin. My father sat back in his chair, looking incredibly proud and expectant. Blake stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his shirt, and flashed his signature charismatic smile. He announced that he had some very exciting news to share with the family tonight. He said that after years of exploring the corporate world and navigating the fast-paced tech industry, he had finally realized his true calling in life. He was going to become a high-end restaurateur. He proudly declared that he was taking a full year off from any traditional work to completely immerse himself in culinary research and find his true passion in the hospitality industry. Aunt Patricia gasped loudly and started clapping her hands. Uncle Greg raised his wineglass high in a congratulatory toast. I sat there staring at my brother in absolute disbelief. Taking a year off from what exactly? He had not held a steady-paying job in over 5 years. But the real shock was yet to come. Blake raised his hands modestly to quiet the scattered applause. He looked down at our parents with an expression of deep manufactured gratitude that made my stomach turn. He told the entire table that none of his brilliant new culinary journey would be possible without the incredible, unwavering support of his amazing parents. He announced that Linda and Thomas had just gifted him $50,000 as seed money to start developing his restaurant concept. He called them his first official investors and promised that their names would be engraved on a brass plaque by the front door of his future establishment. The dining table erupted into cheers and enthusiastic praise. Aunt Patricia wiped a dramatic tear from her eye and praised my mother for being such a wonderfully supportive parent. Uncle Greg loudly commended my father for knowing how to invest in family rather than the stock market. They all raised their glasses again to toast Blake and his imaginary restaurant empire. I did not raise my glass. I sat completely frozen in my chair, my fingers gripping the delicate stem of my wine glass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter. $50,000. They had just handed my 35-year-old unemployed brother $50,000 to fund a culinary delusion. And they were doing it while extorting $2,000 a month from me just to sleep in a childhood twin bed and share a bathroom. The sheer audacity of the situation finally shattered my practiced silence. The cheering died down and people began taking sips of their wine, enjoying the warm glow of the moment. In the quiet lull that followed, I looked directly at my mother across the length of the table. I kept my voice perfectly calm, level, and devoid of any emotion. I did not yell, I did not cry. I simply asked a highly logical question. I asked why I was paying $2,000 a month in rent and utilities to sleep in my old bedroom while Blake was living in a luxury basement suite for free and receiving a $50,000 handout. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and immediate. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that completely sucks the oxygen out of the air. Uncle Greg froze with his glass hovering halfway to his mouth. Aunt Patricia stared at me as if I had just committed a violent crime right in front of her. Blake dropped his smug smile instantly and glared at me across the table with pure hatred. My mother turned a bright, blotchy red. The veins in her neck stood out prominently against her pearl necklace. For a split second, she looked genuinely panicked, realizing that her extended family now knew she was charging her own daughter exorbitant rent while funding her adult son. But that brief panic quickly morphed into pure venomous rage. Linda exploded. She slammed her hands flat on the dining table, making the heavy silverware rattle against the plates. She pointed a shaking finger right at my face. In front of all 10 relatives, she called me an ungrateful penny pincher. Her voice echoed harshly off the walls as she screamed that my corporate job had made me selfish, calculating, and entirely cold. She said I cared more about hoarding my money than supporting my own flesh and blood. She accused me of trying to humiliate my brother in front of the family simply because I was jealous of his free-spirited creative nature. Aunt Patricia immediately chimed in, eager to support her sister. She told me I should be deeply ashamed of myself for bringing up crude financial matters at a joyous family celebration. She lectured me, saying that families are supposed to help each other unconditionally and that keeping financial score was a clear sign of a miserable, lonely person. Uncle Greg nodded vigorously in agreement, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear about how the younger generation had absolutely no respect or gratitude for their hardworking parents. My father stood up abruptly, his face dark with furious anger. He looked down the table at me with absolute contempt. He told me that this was his house and these were his rules. He said that if I did not want to pay my fair way and support the family dynamic, I could get out immediately. He gave me a direct, uncompromising ultimatum right there in front of the entire audience. He told me to either apologize to my mother and brother right now, pay my rent without complaining, or pack my things and leave his house tonight. They expected me to break down. They fully expected me to cry, defend my actions, or beg for their forgiveness, to avoid being cast out. They were waiting for me to apologize so they could graciously accept it and firmly re-establish their dominance over my life. They wanted me to submit to the toxic family dynamic, just like I had always done when I was a helpless child living under their roof. But I was not a child anymore, and I was completely and utterly done playing their twisted game. I did not argue with my father. I did not respond to my mother's vicious insults. I did not even look at Aunt Patricia or Uncle Greg, who were waiting eagerly for my reaction. I simply picked up my wine glass and took one final slow sip of the expensive red wine that my rent money had undoubtedly paid for. I set the glass down gently on the table, making sure it did not make a single sound against the wood. I stood up from my chair, pushing it in neatly and deliberately. I looked at my parents one last time, memorizing the smug, victorious expressions plastered on their faces. Then I turned around and walked calmly toward the stairs. The dining room remained dead silent as my footsteps echoed in the hallway. I went straight up into my childhood bedroom and pulled my 2 large suitcases from the back of the closet. I did not bother folding my clothes perfectly or organizing my shoes. I just threw everything inside, zipping them shut with quick, efficient movements. I grabbed my laptop bag, my toiletries, and my heavy winter coat. The entire packing process took less than 15 minutes of focused, silent work. When I walked back down the stairs, dragging my heavy suitcases behind me, the family was still sitting around the dining table. They were speaking in hushed, urgent whispers, but the whispering stopped the exact moment I appeared in the doorway. My mother looked slightly alarmed, probably not expecting me to actually call their bluff and leave so quickly. Blake looked confused. My father just crossed his arms tightly over his chest and glared at me, daring me to speak. I did not say a single word to any of them. I walked straight into the kitchen and pulled my heavy brass house keys out of my purse. I placed the keys carefully on the granite kitchen counter, right next to the empty catering trays that still smelled of expensive roasted meats. The metal made a sharp, definitive clinking sound against the cold stone surface. I walked out the front door and pulled it shut firmly behind me. The cold night air hit my face instantly, and I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with a sudden, exhilarating sense of freedom. I loaded my suitcases into the trunk of my car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I did not look back at the sprawling brick colonial house. My parents thought they had won a massive victory that night. They thought they had successfully put me in my place and secured their golden child's brilliant future. They had absolutely no idea that I held the deed to the very house they had just kicked me out of. I drove straight downtown. The city lights blurred past my windshield as I put miles between myself and the toxic environment I had just escaped. I did not have a plan for the night, but I had my credit card and a desperate need for absolute peace. I pulled up to the valet stand of one of the most expensive luxury hotels in the heart of Chicago. The uniformed attendant opened my car door and welcomed me warmly. I handed him my keys and watched him drive my practical sedan away, a stark contrast to the leased Porsche sitting in my parents' driveway. Inside the grand lobby, everything was quiet and elegantly appointed. The air smelled of expensive vanilla and fresh flowers. I walked up to the polished marble front desk and booked their premium corner suite for the next 30 days. The concierge handed me a heavy key card and smiled, telling me to let them know if I needed anything at all. I took the private elevator up to the top floor and let myself into a room that was larger than my parents' entire first floor. The suite had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, a massive king-sized bed with crisp white linens, and a marble bathroom that felt like a private spa. I dropped my suitcases near the door and kicked off my shoes. For the first time in 4 weeks, I felt completely safe. There was no booming bass from a basement stereo, no passive-aggressive sighs from the kitchen, and no constant demands for my money. I ordered a late-night meal from room service, took a long hot shower, and finally sat down on the edge of the plush bed. That was when I made the mistake of looking at my phone. The screen was completely lit up with dozens of notifications. The family group chat was exploding. Individual text messages were pouring in from numbers I had not interacted with in months. My mother had wasted absolutely no time spinning her web of lies. While I was driving to the hotel, she had apparently been frantically calling every single relative who had attended the dinner party, along with a few who had not. The first message I opened was from Aunt Patricia. It was a massive block of text entirely in capital letters. She accused me of being a heartless monster. She said that walking out on my aging parents over a petty sibling rivalry was the most disgusting display of disrespect she had ever witnessed. She demanded that I turn my car around immediately, go back to the house, and beg for my mother's forgiveness. She ended the message by stating that my father was suffering from high blood pressure because of my dramatic stunt, and that if he had a heart attack, it would be entirely my fault. The messages from my cousins were just as vicious. My cousin Greg Jr. called me an entitled corporate snob. He told me that family means sticking together through thick and thin, and that my refusal to support Blake's restaurant dream proved I was a jealous, bitter person. Another cousin sent me a long voice note sobbing about how my parents had sacrificed their best years to raise me only for me to abandon them in their time of need. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, scrolling through the endless stream of venom. I pieced together the exact false narrative my mother was actively spreading. Linda was telling everyone that my sudden departure had left them in a terrible financial bind. She claimed that my $2,000 rent payment was absolutely crucial for their monthly household survival. According to her twisted story, I had abruptly withheld the money out of sheer petty jealousy because they decided to invest in Blake's brilliant culinary future. She was playing the perfect victim. She spun a tale of a devoted mother who was just trying to help both of her children succeed. She told the extended family that she had graciously opened her home to me when my condo renovations left me homeless. She claimed she had only asked for a modest contribution to help with the rising utility costs and that my violent refusal to pay it was a deliberate attempt to sabotage Blake's restaurant launch. She made it sound like my $2,000 was the only thing keeping the roof over their heads, and that by leaving, I was essentially throwing my elderly parents out onto the street. The irony was staggering. She was using my departure to gain sympathy and deflect from the fact that she had just handed her 35-year-old unemployed son $50,000. She was weaponizing the extended family, turning them into an angry mob to pressure me into returning and submitting to her control. She knew that public shame was the most powerful tool in her arsenal, and she was wielding it with expert precision. My phone buzzed again in my hand. It was a direct message from Blake. He did not ask how I was or if I had found a safe place to stay. He simply wrote that I was a pathetic loser who could not handle seeing someone else succeed. He told me to stay away from his restaurant when it opened because people like me were toxic to his positive energy. Any normal person might have felt the urge to respond. A weaker version of myself would have frantically typed out a long, detailed defense in the family group chat. I would have explained the math, broken down the unfairness of the situation, and pleaded with them to see reason. I would have desperately tried to clear my name and prove my mother was lying. I would have engaged in a bitter, exhausting war of words that would have ultimately gone nowhere, because toxic families do not care about the truth. They only care about maintaining the established hierarchy. But I was not the weak daughter they thought I was. I felt a cold, calculating calm wash over me. Defending myself in a group chat was beneath me. Arguing with people who were committed to misunderstanding me was a complete waste of my valuable time. Let them believe my mother's lies. Let them think I was a jealous, penny-pinching villain who abandoned her poor, struggling parents. Their ignorance would make the final reveal so much more devastating. I swiped out of the messaging application and opened my email client instead. I needed to act swiftly and decisively. I looked at the time. It was past midnight on a Saturday, but I knew my attorney checked his secure email regularly. I drafted a precise message to Mr. Caldwell, the senior property attorney who managed my blind trust. I requested an emergency meeting at his downtown office for first thing Monday morning. I stated that there had been a significant change in the circumstances regarding the Oakwood Holdings property and that we needed to review the terms of the current occupancy agreement immediately. I marked the email as highly urgent and hit send. Then I did something that felt incredibly liberating. I opened my phone settings, went to the notifications menu, and completely muted the family group chat. I blocked Aunt Patricia, Uncle Greg, and my cousins. I blocked Blake's number. I did not block my parents because I needed a record of their communications for legal purposes, but I set their specific ringtones to silent so they could not disrupt my peace. I put the phone on the nightstand, plugged it into the charger, and turned off the bedside lamp. The city lights from the Chicago skyline cast a soft, beautiful glow across the luxury hotel room. I pulled the heavy down comforter over my shoulders, sinking into the incredibly soft mattress. For the first time in 4 weeks, I did not have to listen to the muffled sounds of Blake's video games or worry about my mother's passive-aggressive comments at the breakfast table. My family thought they had successfully exiled me. They thought they were punishing me by unleashing the extended relatives to tear down my character. They truly believed they held all the power in this dynamic because they controlled the social narrative. They were blindly marching forward with their grand illusion, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to vanish. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The smear campaign did not bother me. I truly welcomed it. Every text message, every lie my mother told every relative who blindly took her side was adding fuel to the fire. They were digging their own graves with their desperate attempts to villainize me. I fell into a deep sleep knowing exactly what I was going to do. Monday morning was going to change everything, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the fallout. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, biting chill cutting through the heavy Chicago air. I walked into the sleek glass and steel skyscraper that housed the prestigious corporate law firm of Caldwell and Associates. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor of the expansive lobby, projecting a cold, hard confidence that I had thoroughly solidified over the weekend. Mr. Caldwell had been my most trusted legal advisor for many years, and he was the only person on earth who knew the full extensive reality of my financial portfolio. He stood up from his massive solid oak desk as I entered the room, offering a firm professional handshake. I took a seat across from him and looked him dead in the eye. I told him that my temporary residency at the property had been abruptly and aggressively terminated. I explained in a calm, steady voice that Thomas and Linda had officially kicked me out of the house on Saturday night after a highly hostile confrontation regarding my financial contributions to the household. Caldwell leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. A rare look of genuine, absolute bewilderment crossed his normally stoic face. He asked me to clarify if I meant the exact same Thomas and Linda who currently occupied the property, legally managed and owned by Oakwood Holdings. When I confirmed this fact, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle that barely broke the silence of the room. He stated that the sheer unbelievable audacity of tenants aggressively kicking out their own landlord was something he had never encountered in his entire 30 years of practicing real estate law. I told him they had absolutely no idea that I was the landlord. I reminded him of the extreme meticulous lengths we went to 5 years ago to ensure my identity remained completely hidden behind the corporate veil of the limited liability company. Caldwell nodded slowly, pulling up a thick, highly encrypted digital file on his computer monitor. He turned the large screen slightly so I could clearly see the original deed transfers and the complex financial rescue documents we had drafted back then. The conversation naturally shifted back to that dark, highly stressful period 5 years ago. My father's manufacturing business had completely imploded due to gross mismanagement, leaving behind a massive mountain of insurmountable debt. He had deliberately hidden the financial ruin from my mother and the rest of the extended family for months out of sheer toxic pride. The devastating truth only came out when the bank finally initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling suburban brick colonial house. My parents were absolutely terrified of the impending public humiliation. In their affluent status, obsessed social circle, losing your home to the bank was considered the ultimate unforgivable disgrace. They were mere days away from being dragged out by the county sheriff and having their pristine, carefully curated reputation destroyed in front of all their wealthy country club friends. I was already doing exceptionally well in my corporate consulting career at that time. I had quietly amassed a significant amount of liquid capital through smart, aggressive investments and ruthless saving. When I learned about their impending homelessness, I could not stand the heartbreaking thought of watching my parents lose everything they had spent decades building, but I also deeply understood my father's fragile, toxic pride. If I had simply stepped forward and offered to buy the house for them or pay off his massive debts, he would have felt completely emasculated. He would have resented me forever for being the successful daughter who had to financially rescue him from his own spectacular business failures. So I made the strategic decision to save them in complete secret. I instructed Mr. Caldwell to legally form Oakwood Holdings LLC, functioning essentially as a blind trust. Through this newly created corporate entity, I swooped in and bought the property directly from the bank right before it went to public auction. I paid off the entirety of their outstanding mortgage debt in one lump sum and secured the property deed firmly under the company name. Then Caldwell, acting as the stern representative for this mysterious private investment firm, approached my desperate parents with an absolute miracle of a deal. He told them that Oakwood Holdings was willing to let them stay in the house under a specialized private financing agreement. To my parents, it looked exactly like they had simply refinanced their massive debt with a highly generous private lender who preferred to remain strictly anonymous. They eagerly signed the thick stack of legal paperwork, thanking their lucky stars that they had been miraculously spared the brutal embarrassment of a public eviction. They never suspected for a single second that their own daughter, whom they constantly belittled, was the sole managing director and sole financial backer behind Oakwood Holdings. Caldwell tapped his expensive silver pen against his desk, bringing my attention back to the present moment. He pulled up the current operating ledger for the suburban property. He reminded me that the monthly payment we legally charged them was absurdly heavily subsidized, because I owned the house completely outright without any bank mortgage. I only charged them enough to cover the annual county property taxes and the basic structural home insurance premiums. Their monthly payment to the LLC was a mere fraction of what a fair market rent or a standard bank mortgage would cost for a luxury property of that massive size in that specific highly desirable zip code. I had been deliberately heavily subsidizing their lavish lifestyle for half a decade, freely absorbing the substantial loss in potential rental income, just so they could comfortably maintain their grand suburban illusion. I felt a sharp, bitter taste in my mouth as I discussed these concrete numbers with my attorney. For 5 long years, they had been living comfortably in my house, paying a massively discounted rate that I had personally engineered solely for their survival. And yet, when I needed a safe place to stay for just 3 short months while my condo was renovated, they had the utter nerve to aggressively demand $2,000 a month for a tiny, outdated childhood bedroom. They had treated me like a heavy financial burden while remaining entirely oblivious to the fact that my silent, ongoing generosity was the only reason they were not living in a cramped, cheap apartment. Caldwell looked closely at the digital ledger and then looked back at me. He pointed out the stark legal absurdity of the current situation. He stated that since I was the sole legal owner of the property, my parents had absolutely zero right to charge me rent or demand any form of financial payment for my temporary stay. By attempting to illegally sublease a portion of the property to me and successfully extorting funds, they were actually in direct material violation of the occupancy agreement they had signed with Oakwood Holdings 5 years ago. They had blatantly broken the very legal contract that was keeping them safely off the streets. We sat there in the quiet, refined elegance of his office, letting the staggering, heavy irony of the situation settle over us. My parents had forcefully kicked me out of a house that I legally owned. They had demanded $2,000 a month from the exact person who had secretly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to save them from total catastrophic financial ruin. They had loudly called me a selfish, ungrateful penny pincher in front of the entire extended family, while I was actively, deliberately sacrificing my own personal investment returns to quietly subsidize the very roof over their heads. The sheer ungrateful audacity of their actions was almost difficult to fully comprehend. They had prioritized their false pride and their golden child over the daughter who was quietly keeping their entire world intact. I needed to understand the exact flow of their finances because the math simply was not making any sense to me. If they were paying such a drastically reduced amount to Oakwood Holdings every single month, they should have had plenty of disposable income to sustain themselves without ever needing to extort $2,000 from me. I leaned closer to the bright monitor, tracing the lines of data with my eyes. The spreadsheet displayed 5 years of consistent on-time payments, proving that the incredibly low monthly rate I had set was easily manageable for them. Yet they had acted so incredibly desperate for my money during that disastrous dinner party. They had demanded my hard-earned corporate salary with a vicious entitlement that suggested they were funneling cash elsewhere. I asked Caldwell to open the transaction history for the LLC business bank account. I also asked him to pull up the specific records showing my $2,000 personal transfers into their private accounts. Caldwell clicked a few buttons, and a long, detailed spreadsheet quickly appeared directly on the large monitor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool, polished edge of the desk. My eyes tracked the endless rows of data illuminating the large monitor. The financial narrative unfolding before me was so brutally transparent, it almost took my breath away. Mr. Caldwell pulled up the local county property tax assessments and the current fair market rental rates for comparable luxury homes in that specific highly coveted zip code. A house of that massive square footage sitting on two perfectly landscaped acres in that pristine neighborhood would command a monthly mortgage payment of at least $6,000. My parents were only paying Oakwood Holdings $2,000 a month. I had been giving them a $4,000 discount every single month for 60 consecutive months. They were living a luxurious suburban lifestyle for a fraction of the actual cost, completely unaware that their successful corporate daughter was quietly absorbing the massive difference. I asked Caldwell to isolate the last 12 months of their payment history and cross-reference the exact dates with the local banking records we had access to. Over the past year, my parents had managed to systematically stockpile those substantial monthly savings into a high-yield private savings account. They had amassed exactly $48,000 simply because I was quietly subsidizing their daily survival. Then my eyes darted to the personal transaction records from my own private checking account. On the very first day of my temporary stay, I had obediently wired them my initial $2,000 rent payment. The ledger showed that less than 24 hours after my hard-earned corporate salary landed in their joint checking account, they executed a massive wire transfer. They combined their $48,000 in hoarded mortgage savings with my fresh $2,000 rent payment. The total amount transferred out of their account was exactly $50,000. The recipient account belonged exclusively to Blake. The sickening math finally clicked into place with absolute crystal clarity. The $50,000 seed money for Blake's imaginary restaurant empire had not come from my parents' brilliant financial planning or their supposed lifelong hard work. It had come directly from me. They had taken the massive housing subsidy I secretly provided them, scooped up the exorbitant rent they forcefully extorted from me, and handed every single cent of it directly to their golden child. They were literally using my money to play the role of wealthy philanthropic investors for a 35-year-old man who contributed absolutely nothing to society. The sheer profound scale of the double betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was sitting in a silent corporate law office staring at undeniable legal proof that my own parents viewed me as nothing more than a highly convenient automated teller machine. They had shamelessly weaponized my brief presence in my own childhood bedroom to extract the final $2,000 they needed to fully fund Blake's delusional culinary ambitions. They had treated my arrival not as a family reunion, but as a highly lucrative business opportunity to finish enriching their favorite son. I was secretly funding the roof over their heads, keeping them safe from public suburban ruin, while they treated me like a heavy, unwanted financial burden. They had the unbelievable audacity to call me a selfish, ungrateful penny pincher in front of our entire extended family, while standing inside a house that I bought and paid for. They were actively bleeding their silent savior dry to continuously feed an entitled parasite. The realization washed over me, changing my perspective on every interaction I had endured over the past 4 weeks. Every time my mother complained about the cost of groceries, while preparing Blake's elaborate meals, she was using my money. Every time my father proudly talked about Blake's entrepreneurial spirit, he was boasting about a venture funded by my corporate salary and my hidden real estate generosity. They truly believed they were superior to me. They genuinely thought they had successfully manipulated their cold corporate daughter into finally contributing her fair share to the family dynamic. The profound sickness of their blatant favoritism was staggering. They did not just prefer Blake over me. They were willing to financially sabotage my life to sustain his endless childish illusions. Mr. Caldwell watched my face carefully as I processed the staggering weight of their deception. He remained completely silent, allowing me the necessary time to absorb the cold, hard facts displayed on the glowing monitor. He had seen many complex family disputes throughout his long career in property law, but the predatory nature of this specific betrayal clearly disturbed him. After a long, tense moment, he gently cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He steepled his hands together and leaned forward, offering his professional legal counsel. He stated that my parents had undeniably breached the strict terms of their private occupancy agreement by attempting to illegally sublease a portion of the property to me and successfully extorting funds. They were in direct material violation of the contract they had signed with Oakwood Holdings 5 years ago. Because of this blatant violation, he could legally initiate formal eviction proceedings immediately. He offered to print out a formal 30-day notice to vacate right then and there. He promised to have a certified process server deliver it to their front door by noon. He assured me that we had every legal right to remove them from the premises and list the property on the open market. They had broken the rules and they had forfeited their right to my secret charity. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, feeling a dark, icy calm settle deep within my bones. The temptation to drop the ultimate hammer right now was incredibly strong. I could easily picture the sheer blind panic on my mother's face as a uniformed process server handed her a formal eviction notice. I could clearly imagine my father's absolute horror as he realized his grand suburban facade was finally crumbling to dust. I could envision Blake realizing he would have to pack up his luxury basement suite and actually face the real world. But swift, immediate retaliation felt entirely too easy. It felt far too clean for the magnitude of the disrespect and humiliation they had intentionally shown me. If I evicted them today, they would simply spin a new false narrative. They would paint themselves as tragic, helpless victims of a cruel, faceless corporation that swooped in and stole their beloved family home. They would use the eviction to garner endless sympathy from Aunt Patricia, Uncle Greg, and the rest of the extended family. They would likely try to move in with a relative, continuing to live off the generosity of others while playing the role of suburban martyrs. I needed them to fully experience the crushing weight of their own terrible financial choices first. I needed the pressure to build slowly and inevitably until they had absolutely no one left to blame but themselves. I looked away from the monitor and met my attorney's steady gaze. I shook my head slowly, giving him a cold, hollow smile. I told him we would not be evicting them today. Let them hang themselves first, I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I explained my strategy to Caldwell, outlining exactly how we were going to tighten the invisible noose they had willingly placed around their own necks. I told him to immediately cut off all direct human communication between Oakwood Holdings and my parents. I ordered him to route their specific phone numbers to a generic automated voicemail system. If they had any questions, concerns, or sudden financial panics regarding their occupancy agreement, they would no longer be able to speak to a sympathetic human voice. They were now dealing exclusively with a cold, unfeeling, faceless corporate entity that did not care about their suburban status or their golden child's restaurant dreams. I instructed Caldwell that any written correspondence from them was to be filed away without an immediate response. They had built their entire identity around maintaining a perfect illusion of wealth and control. Now they were about to discover what happens when the hidden safety net is quietly removed. The trap was set, and all I had to do was sit back in my luxury hotel suite and wait for the financial pressure to break them. By withholding my $2,000 monthly payment, they were instantly going to feel a severe deficit in their everyday operating budget. They had grown entirely accustomed to using my hard-earned money as a reliable buffer to fund Blake's excessive spending habits. Without my ongoing financial compliance, their carefully balanced house of cards would begin to sway. Blake would undoubtedly continue demanding more resources for his non-existent business, and my parents would have absolutely no way to satisfy his endless appetite. They would soon realize that their harsh ultimatum at the dinner party was the most catastrophic financial mistake they could have possibly made. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, feeling a profound sense of absolute power. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for his time and walked out of the corporate law office. The game had fundamentally changed, and the countdown to their inevitable ruin had officially begun. The transition from having an extra $2,000 of disposable income every single month to suddenly having absolutely nothing extra hit my parents with the brutal force of a freight train. They had grown completely accustomed to treating my rent money as their own personal slush fund. Without my monthly cash injection, their carefully balanced suburban illusion began to violently crack at the seams. I knew exactly how tight their margins were because Mr. Caldwell and I had meticulously reviewed their financial footprint. They were living paycheck to paycheck, trying to maintain the outward appearance of massive generational wealth. Within the very first week of my absence, my mother had to quietly cancel her weekly luxury spa appointments. She stopped hosting her elaborate Tuesday afternoon bridge club luncheons because she could no longer afford the premium imported catering she usually passed off as her own cooking. My father had to quietly downgrade his premium golf club membership to a basic tier, blaming the change on a sudden lack of free time rather than a severe lack of funds. They were suffocating under the heavy weight of their own extravagant lifestyle, but they were far too proud to ever admit defeat to their wealthy neighbors. The true financial hemorrhage, however, was not their country club dues or their luxury car leases. The absolute financial ruin was living directly beneath their feet in the basement suite. Blake had cheerfully taken their $50,000 seed money and immediately set out to build his imaginary restaurant empire. But Blake had absolutely no intention of actually working. He did not draft a single business plan. He did not scout commercial real estate locations. He did not hire an architect or consult with city planners regarding zoning permits. Instead, Blake decided that the most crucial first step in opening a high-end restaurant was conducting extensive culinary research. In Blake's delusional mind, culinary research meant making reservations at the most expensive Michelin-starred restaurants in downtown Chicago and ordering the most lavish tasting menus available. He spent thousands of dollars treating his friends to extravagant dinners, claiming he was networking with potential future investors and studying flavor profiles. He bought top-of-the-line professional kitchen equipment for the basement suite, but never actually took it out of the original cardboard packaging. When the initial $50,000 began to rapidly dwindle, Blake completely panicked. But instead of adjusting his spending or actually looking for a commercial lease, he decided to aggressively pivot his business strategy. He loudly announced to our parents that the traditional restaurant model was entirely dead. He claimed that the true future of hospitality was exclusive underground supper clubs and high society networking events. He told my parents that he needed to start hosting private, upscale parties in the basement suite to build an elite clientele list before he even opened a physical location. My parents, desperate to believe that their golden child was a misunderstood business genius, bought into the delusion completely. They allowed him to transform the luxury basement into his own personal nightclub. Almost immediately, Blake began throwing incredibly loud, massive parties every single Friday and Saturday night. He invited dozens of people he barely knew, treating them to premium experiences that he could not actually afford. The sheer entitlement of my brother was breathtaking. Because he was rapidly burning through his own seed money, he began aggressively demanding that my parents cover the exorbitant costs of his underground networking events. He told my mother that providing high-end catering and top-shelf liquor was a necessary business expense for the family. He manipulated them by claiming that if they cut off his funding now, they would be actively sabotaging his only chance at success. He made them feel incredibly guilty for questioning his methods, reminding them that true entrepreneurs require massive financial backing to launch their visions. Linda and Thomas, terrified of looking like unsupportive parents, quietly folded under his aggressive demands. My mother began draining her own meager savings accounts to buy cases of expensive vodka and imported champagne for Blake's guests. My father maxed out 2 different credit cards to pay for the high-end catering services Blake insisted upon. They were literally bankrupting themselves to buy friends for their 35-year-old son. The parties themselves were an absolute nightmare for the quiet, pristine suburban neighborhood. Dozens of luxury cars would line the manicured streets, blocking driveways and irritating the wealthy neighbors. Loud thumping bass from Blake's massive sound system would rattle the floorboards of the house until 3 in the morning. Drunk strangers would wander around my parents' perfectly landscaped backyard, leaving trash in the flower beds and empty glass bottles near the property line. The intense, overwhelming stress of the situation finally began to severely fracture my parents' marriage. From the comfort of my luxury hotel suite, I did not have to guess what was happening behind their closed doors. I had direct, undisputed access to their misery. Because I was the sole legal managing director of Oakwood Holdings, LLC. I was the official registered property owner on file with the highly strict Neighborhood Homeowners Association. Every time Blake's guests parked illegally on the street, the HOA sent a formal digital violation notice directly to my private corporate email inbox. Every time the neighbors complained about the booming music violating the strict midnight noise curfew, I received an official time-stamped warning. I would sit on the balcony of my hotel room sipping a glass of expensive red wine and calmly read the detailed reports of the chaos unfolding in my house. The HOA complaints painted a vivid, highly entertaining picture of the total breakdown of my parents' pristine suburban image. I received angry emails from the neighborhood board president detailing how an intoxicated guest had driven over my mother's prized rose bushes. I read formal warnings about empty beer bottles being left on the sidewalks. I even received a notice threatening to call the local police if the disruptive underground parties did not cease immediately. I knew exactly how my parents were reacting to these humiliating notices, because they had spent their entire lives worshiping the opinions of their neighbors. The public shame of being the loud, disruptive house on the block would be absolutely destroying my mother. She had spent decades carefully cultivating a perfect, elegant reputation among the neighborhood wives. Now she was the mother of the 35-year-old nuisance who was trashing the street and treating the upscale subdivision like a cheap college fraternity house. The financial and social pressure caused massive explosive fights between Linda and Thomas. While I could not hear the arguments directly, the outcome was glaringly obvious in the financial data my attorney forwarded to me. My parents were completely missing their credit card payments. Their bank accounts were bleeding dry. My father was desperately trying to stop Blake from throwing more parties, while my mother fiercely defended her golden son, claiming he just needed a little more time to find the right investors. Thomas was furious that his hard-earned reputation was being dragged through the mud by the HOA board. He demanded that Blake shut down the supper club concept immediately and start looking for a real job. Linda hysterically accused Thomas of giving up on their son just when he was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. She screamed that they had already invested $50,000 and could not afford to pull the plug now. They were trapped in a toxic, vicious cycle of sunk cost fallacy, completely unable to admit that Blake was a failure and that they had made a catastrophic financial error. Blake naturally played the victim perfectly. Whenever Thomas tried to cut off the liquor budget, Blake would threaten to leave and never speak to them again. He would dramatically pack a single bag and walk toward the front door, knowing exactly how to trigger my mother's deep-seated abandonment issues. Linda would break down in tears, beg him to stay, and immediately force Thomas to hand over another credit card. Blake had weaponized their unconditional love and turned their own house into a hostile environment where he held absolute total control. The sheer irony of the situation was almost too delicious to fully process. They had kicked me out because I calmly asked a logical question about fairness. They had called me selfish and cold because I worked hard for my money and expected basic respect in return. Now they were trapped in a house with a son who was actively, gleefully destroying their finances and their social standing. I had been the quiet, reliable pillar, keeping their foundation stable, and they had forcefully smashed that pillar to pieces just to protect a parasite. I did not intervene. I did not reply to the angry HOA emails. I simply forwarded them all to Mr. Caldwell to add to our growing mountain of legal evidence regarding property mismanagement and lease violations. Every noise complaint, every parking fine, every warning about property damage was another nail in the coffin. I was meticulously building a flawless, airtight legal case that would leave them with absolutely zero room to maneuver when the final hammer dropped. I spent my days focusing on my corporate consulting career, securing massive new contracts and expanding my own professional network. I spent my evenings finalizing the design choices for my new condo, picking out imported Italian tile and custom hardwood floors. I was thriving, advancing, and building real tangible wealth. My parents were drowning, sinking deeper into a financial abyss of their own making. The countdown clock was ticking louder every single day. Their cash reserves were completely depleted. The $50,000 seed money was gone, vanished into expensive steaks, premium vodka, and meaningless parties. They had no savings left. They had no extra income. They had no backup plan. They were running entirely on fumes and desperate delusions. I knew that the breaking point was rapidly approaching. They were going to have to make a drastic, desperate move to keep Blake's imaginary empire alive. And when they made that move, I would be waiting perfectly positioned to watch the entire facade completely and spectacularly shatter. The inevitable escalation arrived on a brisk Thursday morning. I was sitting at the sleek glass desk in my hotel suite, reviewing a global supply chain contract while sipping a perfectly brewed cup of black coffee. My phone, which rested silently on a wireless charging pad, suddenly illuminated with a new voicemail notification. I had deliberately set my parents' contact profiles to bypass ringing and go straight to the recording system. I picked up the device and tapped the screen to play the audio file. The harsh, grating voice of my father immediately filled the quiet luxury of the room. Thomas was not just angry, he sounded completely unhinged, driven by a toxic mixture of financial panic and wounded patriarchal pride. He started the recording by shouting that I was a massive disappointment to the family name. He blamed me entirely for the sudden, stressful chaos consuming their lives. According to his twisted logic, my refusal to pay the $2,000 monthly rent was a direct act of malicious financial sabotage. He claimed that because I had selfishly cut off my financial contributions, they were now struggling to maintain the household operations and adequately support Blake's entrepreneurial vision. He actually complained about the recent neighborhood homeowner association fines, angrily stating that if I had just paid my fair share, they could have afforded a proper commercial venue for Blake's events instead of being forced to host them in the basement. Then my father dropped the absolute masterpiece of his delusional rant. He took a deep, aggressive breath and delivered his grand ultimatum. He told me that since I adamantly refused to support my own flesh and blood, they were being forced to take drastic, sweeping measures to ensure Blake's success. He proudly announced that he and my mother were going to leverage their greatest financial asset to save the family. They were planning to go to their bank and take out a massive second mortgage on the house. He confidently stated that they had accumulated massive equity in the property over the years, and they were going to use that substantial capital to properly fund Blake's restaurant. He ended the voicemail by telling me that when Blake became a famous hospitality mogul, I would not be welcome at his grand opening and that I should be deeply ashamed of my utter lack of family loyalty. I sat in my plush leather chair and listened to the entire voicemail a second time just to fully savor the sheer staggering absurdity of his words. The absolute arrogance it took to threaten me with the equity of a house he did not even own was breathtaking. Thomas genuinely believed he was the king of a suburban castle, holding the power to leverage hundreds of thousands of dollars in property value at a moment's notice. He had completely convinced himself that a quick trip to the local bank branch would magically solve all their self-inflicted financial disasters and provide Blake with an endless fountain of cash. I smiled a cold, genuine smile. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud folder and immediately forwarded a copy to Mr. Caldwell. My attorney responded less than 5 minutes later with a single brief sentence, stating that he could not wait to see the look on the bank loan officer's face when Thomas attempted to borrow money against a property deeded entirely to Oakwood Holdings LLC. My father was blindly marching directly toward a concrete wall of legal reality, and he was accelerating his pace purely out of spite. The financial panic in my parents' household must have reached critical mass because the collateral damage quickly began spilling over into the extended family network. Just 3 days after my father's unhinged voicemail, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Aunt Patricia. I usually ignored her frantic communications completely, but the timing of this specific call intrigued me. I wanted to know exactly how desperate my mother had become in her quest to secure funding for Blake's sinking ship. I tapped the green button and accepted the call, remaining completely silent as I brought the phone to my ear. Aunt Patricia did not even bother saying hello. She immediately launched into a hysterical, breathless tirade. She demanded to know what kind of heartless monster could deliberately destroy her own parents' golden years. Her voice was shrill and quivering with manufactured outrage as she accused me of committing severe financial abuse. I listened calmly as Patricia revealed the brand new desperate narrative my mother had just spun for the extended family. Linda had apparently spent the entire morning frantically calling every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in her contact list, begging for emergency personal loans. But Linda could not simply admit that she and Thomas had squandered all their money on expensive liquor and basement parties for their 35-year-old unemployed son. That would require taking actual accountability and ruining her pristine suburban image. Instead, Linda had crafted a spectacular malicious lie to explain their sudden catastrophic poverty. She told the entire extended family that before I abruptly moved out of the house, I had somehow managed to completely drain their retirement savings accounts. According to my mother's elaborate fiction, I had secretly accessed their financial portfolios and stolen their hard-earned life savings to fund the lavish renovations on my new city condo. Linda had been crying hysterically on the phone to Aunt Patricia, claiming that Thomas was having chest pains from the stress of facing total bankruptcy. She painted a tragic picture of two loving, devoted parents who had been ruthlessly victimized by their cold, calculating corporate daughter. She explicitly told Patricia that Blake was the only one trying to hold their shattered family together, selflessly putting his restaurant dreams on hold to care for his destitute parents. Aunt Patricia was buying every single word of this toxic fiction. She sobbed into the phone, telling me that Linda was practically having a nervous breakdown in her living room. She said that my parents were facing terrible mounting debts and could not even afford their basic utility bills this month. Patricia then pivoted to her ultimate goal, applying a massive crushing guilt trip designed to force me into immediate compliance. She demanded that I write a massive check today to save my parents from completely losing everything they had worked for. She said that if I had a single shred of human decency left in my dark soul, I would wire them $50,000 immediately to replace the retirement funds I had allegedly stolen. She threatened me, stating that if I did not fix this financial crisis right now, the entire extended family would completely disown me forever. She said I would be permanently dead to all of them, and that my name would become an absolute curse word at every future holiday gathering. She ranted for another 3 full minutes, exhausting her entire vocabulary of insults and emotional manipulations. She expected me to break down crying, defend my innocence, and desperately offer my bank account details to earn back the approval of the family network. She fully expected me to cave under the heavy, coordinated pressure of suburban social shaming. I listened to her heavy breathing through the phone speaker as she finally paused, waiting for my tearful surrender. I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no shame, no desire to explain the complex truth of the blind trust or the $50,000 they had willingly handed to Blake. Explaining reality to people committed to a comfortable lie is a foolish waste of energy. My mother had chosen to double down on her deception, actively choosing to drag my name through the mud rather than face the consequences of enabling her golden child. They wanted a villain to blame for their empty bank accounts, and I was perfectly comfortable playing that role if it meant sealing their fate. I took a slow, calm breath. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of defense against her wild accusations. I spoke with the icy, detached precision of an executive terminating a worthless contract. I told Aunt Patricia that if Thomas and Linda were truly experiencing such a severe, sudden financial emergency, they already knew exactly what they needed to do to solve it. They should talk to their bank, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or warmth. Before Aunt Patricia could even process the meaning of my words or utter another screeching insult, I ended the call. I immediately opened my phone settings and permanently blocked her number, ensuring that none of her subsequent frantic callbacks would ever reach me. I set the phone down on the glass desk and returned my attention to my corporate supply chain documents, feeling a profound wave of dark, satisfying anticipation wash over me. By delivering that single cold shoulder response, I had effectively poured gasoline directly onto the raging fire of their financial desperation. I knew exactly what Aunt Patricia was going to do next. She was going to immediately call my mother back and report that I was a completely lost cause, refusing to offer a single dime of financial support. That harsh rejection would completely eliminate any lingering hope my parents had of utilizing the extended family to bail them out of their self-inflicted ruin. Without my corporate salary to extort, and without the wealthy relatives to manipulate their options, were now reduced to absolute zero. My calculated refusal left them with only one possible avenue of escape. They would be forced to execute the exact desperate plan my father had furiously threatened in his morning voicemail. Thomas and Linda would have to gather their financial paperwork, put on their best designer clothes, and march directly into their local bank branch. They would proudly sit across from a loan officer and confidently attempt to extract a massive second mortgage against a sprawling suburban property they did not legally own. I had just accelerated their march toward total, undeniable public humiliation, and there was absolutely no turning back now. The financial reality of their situation had become entirely unmanageable. They were effectively trapped in a high-end suburban neighborhood with rapidly dwindling resources and absolutely no way to access the phantom equity they believed they possessed. My parents had fully convinced themselves that they were sitting on a massive gold mine. In their distorted worldview, the luxurious brick colonial was a bottomless piggy bank just waiting to be cracked open. Since their desperate attempt to secure a second mortgage had been flatly rejected by their local bank due to their lack of legal ownership, they decided to take the most extreme and audacious step possible. They decided to sell the house entirely. Thomas and Linda rationalized this catastrophic decision by claiming it was a strategic downsizing effort. They convinced themselves and anyone who would listen that they were ready for a simpler, elegant life in a luxury condominium, while the massive proceeds from the house sale would officially launch Blake's culinary empire. They were so utterly blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to maintain their social standing that they completely ignored the strict legal terms of the occupancy agreement they had signed with Oakwood Holdings, LLC, 5 years ago. They had lived under the illusion of ownership for so long that they actually believed the illusion was reality. My mother wasted absolutely no time making their grand real estate plans public. She immediately took to her various social media accounts, posting overly filtered photos of the house and writing lengthy, dramatic captions about embarking on an exciting new chapter. She bragged extensively to her bridge club and to the entire extended family about their upcoming highly lucrative property sale. She painted a picture of incredible wealth, claiming that the Chicago real estate market was booming and that they were poised to make a massive, unprecedented profit. She even tagged Blake in the posts, loudly proclaiming that his brilliant restaurant concept was fully funded and ready to launch. She was doubling down on the lie, aggressively pushing the narrative that they were wildly successful investors, while completely erasing my existence from their perfect suburban story. They needed a realtor who matched their inflated sense of self-importance. They bypassed the practical local agents and hired a flashy, highly aggressive luxury real estate broker named Marcus Vance. Marcus was known in their affluent circles for driving a custom sports car, wearing tailored Italian suits, and aggressively marketing multi-million-dollar properties. He was exactly the kind of status symbol my parents loved to associate themselves with. They invited Marcus to the house, offering him expensive wine and giving him a grand tour of the property, all while boasting about the extensive customized upgrades they had allegedly made over the years. They confidently told Marcus to list the property at the absolute top of the market value, completely certain that a bidding war would ensue. Marcus, being a seasoned and aggressive professional, immediately began the standard preparations for listing a high-end suburban estate. He hired a team of professional photographers to capture the property at sunset. He drafted flowery marketing copy highlighting the spacious basement suite and the manicured 2-acre lawn. But before Marcus could officially launch the listing on the multiple listing service, he had to perform the most basic fundamental step in real estate. He had to pull the official county property records to verify the legal ownership and prepare the initial seller disclosures. Marcus sat in his sleek downtown office sipping an espresso and logged into the county database. He typed in the exact address of my parents' sprawling brick colonial, fully expecting to see the names Thomas and Linda proudly listed on the deed. Instead, the search results returned a massive, impenetrable brick wall. The screen clearly displayed that the property was not owned by Thomas and Linda. It was not owned by a family trust bearing their name. The official legal owner of the property, purchased 5 years prior in a swift cash transaction, was Oakwood Holdings LLC. Marcus furrowed his brow, assuming there must be a clerical error or a complex family trust arrangement he was not privy to. He dug deeper into the county records, pulling the original deed transfer documents from 5 years ago. The paperwork was immaculate and absolutely clear. The property had been transferred directly from the foreclosing bank to the corporate entity. There was no mention of my parents anywhere on the actual deed. They were not co-owners. They were not trustees. According to the strict, unyielding letter of the law, they were nothing more than occupants living in a house owned entirely by a faceless corporation. Marcus immediately picked up his phone and called Thomas. He assumed this was simply a minor bureaucratic hurdle that needed clarification. He asked my father to provide the specific legal documentation proving he had the authority to sell a property owned by Oakwood Holdings. Thomas was entirely caught off guard by the question. He stammered slightly before confidently stating that Oakwood Holdings was simply the private lending firm that handled their mortgage refinancing 5 years ago. He insisted that he and Linda were the true owners and that the LLC merely held the lien on the property. Marcus rubbed his temples, realizing that this situation was rapidly deteriorating from a lucrative luxury listing into a massive legal disaster. He explained to my father using slow, careful, professional language that Oakwood Holdings did not just hold a lien. Oakwood Holdings held the actual physical deed to the house. Marcus stated that based on the county records, Thomas and Linda possessed absolutely zero legal authority to list, market, or sell the property. They could not authorize a sale because they did not own the asset. My father absolutely exploded. He aggressively accused the realtor of incompetence, demanding that Marcus fix the supposed paperwork error immediately. Thomas screamed into the phone that he had been paying the mortgage on that house for decades and that no faceless corporation was going to steal his equity. He demanded that Marcus push the listing live, regardless of the bureaucratic red tape. Marcus, however, was a licensed professional who valued his career far more than my father's fragile ego. He calmly but firmly informed Thomas that listing a property without the legal consent of the deed holder was an egregious violation of real estate law. He told my father that until he could produce a legally binding document from Oakwood Holdings authorizing the sale, the listing was completely frozen. The panic that set into my parents' household was instantaneous and absolute. Their grand master plan to fund Blake's lifestyle and maintain their wealthy facade had just collided violently with undeniable legal reality. They had bragged to the entire extended family about their impending windfall. They had made bold public promises about financing a restaurant. Now they were staring down the barrel of a humiliating truth. They could not sell the house. They could not access the equity. They were entirely at the mercy of a corporate entity they did not understand. Thomas immediately began frantically dialing the phone number listed on the original 5-year-old occupancy agreement they had signed with Oakwood Holdings. He expected to reach a sympathetic loan officer who would quickly resolve this frustrating misunderstanding. He expected to easily bully his way through the corporate bureaucracy and reclaim his stolen equity. He had absolutely no idea that the phone number he was dialing had been explicitly rerouted by my attorney just days prior. He was not going to reach a helpful customer service representative. He was not going to find a solution to his catastrophic financial crisis. He was about to be dropped directly into an automated voicemail system deliberately designed to offer no answers and no comfort. The walls were rapidly closing in on their suburban illusion, and the absolute worst was yet to come. They were about to discover exactly who was holding the deed to their lives. The automated voice that answered my father's frantic phone call was entirely devoid of any human empathy. Thank you for calling Oakwood Holdings LLC. Our offices are currently closed. All tenant inquiries must be submitted in writing to our legal department. Thomas gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles turning white as he listened to the repeated robotic message. He pressed 0, attempting to bypass the system and reach a live operator, but the call simply disconnected. He dialed the number again and again, leaving increasingly hostile voicemails demanding that someone from the management team call him back immediately to fix what he called a ridiculous clerical error regarding his property deed. When leaving angry voicemails failed to produce a magical solution, Thomas decided to try a different approach. He drove directly to the local branch of the traditional bank that had originally held their mortgage 5 years ago. He marched up to the customer service desk, demanding to speak with the branch manager. He loudly explained that a predatory company called Oakwood Holdings was somehow interfering with his ability to sell his home. The branch manager, a polite but firm woman, pulled up his old account information on her computer. She looked at the screen and then looked back at my father with a completely baffled expression. She informed him that the bank had absolutely no current relationship with him or the property. She stated clearly that his original mortgage had been paid off in full and closed completely 5 years prior. The payoff had been executed via a massive wire transfer from a private corporate buyer. The bank had no records, no lien, and absolutely no power to help him. Thomas was entirely on his own dealing with a corporate phantom he could not control. Instead of facing the terrifying reality of their situation, my parents did what they always did when confronted with undeniable failure. They buried their heads deep in the sand and aggressively doubled down on their delusions. Linda simply refused to acknowledge the impending financial catastrophe. She convinced Thomas that this was just a minor legal hiccup, a temporary paperwork delay, that their imaginary private lender would sort out after the weekend. To soothe her own building anxiety and maintain her iron grip on the family narrative, she decided to push forward with her grand social plans. She was going to host an extravagant Sunday brunch at the house specifically designed to celebrate Blake's upcoming restaurant venture. I watched the entire pathetic spectacle unfold in real time from the comfort of my luxury hotel suite. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly what was happening, because Aunt Patricia was documenting every single second of it on her public social media accounts. I sat on my plush sofa sipping a fresh cup of coffee and refreshing her digital feed. Patricia posted a rapid succession of photos showing the sprawling dining room bathed in warm, Sunday morning sunlight. The table was covered in expensive catered food. There were silver trays piled high with imported pastries, fresh smoked salmon, and crystal pitchers filled with premium mimosas. My parents had clearly maxed out yet another credit card to fund this lavish display of fake wealth. In the background of the photos, I could see the extended family and several wealthy neighborhood friends mingling and laughing. Uncle Greg was holding a plate of food, loudly discussing his golf swing. Aunt Patricia was wearing a brightly colored floral dress, posing for selfies with my mother. Linda looked pale and slightly tense around the eyes, but she was wearing her best designer blouse and smiling broadly for the cameras. She was playing the role of the proud, successful matriarch to absolute perfection. She was actively selling the lie to everyone in the room, boasting about their lucrative upcoming house sale and how they were selflessly downsizing to support their genius son. Blake was naturally the star of the show. He was wearing a tailored linen blazer over a designer t-shirt, looking every bit the arrogant, entitled parasite he truly was. Aunt Patricia posted a long video clip of him holding court in the center of the living room. I turned up the volume on my phone, listening to his sickeningly confident voice. He was telling a group of my parents' country club friends about his visionary restaurant concept. He threw around meaningless industry buzzwords, talking about disruptive culinary experiences and synergistic flavor profiles. He spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had never actually worked a hard day in his entire life. The guests nodded in polite agreement, completely unaware that the man lecturing them about business success was currently bankrupting his own parents. The sheer level of disconnect from reality was staggering. My parents were standing inside a house they did not own, hosting a party they could not afford to celebrate, a business that did not exist. They were actively celebrating their own financial execution. They were surrounded by people who only respected them for their perceived wealth, and they were desperately trying to keep the illusion alive for just one more afternoon. They believed that if they just acted wealthy enough, the universe would somehow bend to their will and magically resolve the massive legal roadblock preventing their house sale. As the afternoon wore on, the brunch transitioned into its main event. Aunt Patricia started a live video broadcast on her social media feed, holding her phone high to capture the entire room. I watched intently, knowing exactly what was currently speeding toward their front door. In the video, my mother tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, calling for everyone's attention. The chatter died down, and the guests gathered around the grand staircase, turning their expectant faces toward Blake. Blake stepped up onto the bottom stair, elevating himself above the crowd. He held a fresh mimosa in his right hand, flashing his bright, charismatic smile. He cleared his throat and began his grand toast. He thanked everyone for coming to celebrate the official launch of his new hospitality brand. He spoke about the challenges of being a young entrepreneur and the fierce dedication required to truly innovate in the modern culinary landscape. The guests murmured in polite agreement, captivated by his practiced charm. Then Blake turned his gaze toward my parents, who were standing near the front entryway. He raised his glass toward them, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. He told the crowd that none of his success would be possible without the incredible sacrifice of his loving parents. He called them his angel investors, his biggest supporters, and his ultimate inspiration. He loudly announced to the entire room that they were currently in the process of selling their beautiful family estate simply to ensure his dream became a reality. He asked everyone to raise their glasses to Thomas and Linda, the most selfless, generous parents in the world. The guests raised their mimosas, cheering and clapping for my parents. Linda wiped a delicate tear from her cheek, beaming with absolute pride. Thomas stood tall, puffing out his chest and soaking in the admiration of his wealthy peers. It was the exact moment of public validation they had been desperately craving. It was the absolute peak of their suburban delusion. Right as the cheering reached its highest volume, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. It was a series of loud, sharp raps that cut directly through the applause. The sound was so demanding and authoritative that the guests immediately fell silent. Thomas, still smiling proudly from the toast, turned around and opened the heavy wooden door, expecting to greet a late-arriving guest. Instead of a friend holding a bottle of wine, there was a man standing on the porch, wearing a dark professional uniform. He was a bonded legal courier carrying a thick, secure clipboard. I knew exactly who he was because Mr. Caldwell had dispatched him from the downtown law firm precisely an hour ago. The courier did not smile. He did not offer any polite suburban pleasantries. He simply looked at my father and asked if he was Thomas. My father, confused by the formal interruption, nodded and confirmed his identity. The courier pulled a heavy, oversized certified envelope from his secure bag. The envelope was bright white and stamped with bold red lettering indicating highly sensitive legal documents. The courier held out his electronic clipboard, demanding a direct physical signature to confirm receipt of the package. The live video broadcast captured the entire interaction perfectly. The camera angle showed Thomas hesitating, his proud smile slowly faltering as he stared at the intimidating legal envelope. Linda stepped up beside him, her face dropping its carefully curated, joyful expression. The guests in the background watched in awkward silence, sensing that the festive mood had just been violently punctured by something serious. Blake stood frozen on the bottom stair, his champagne glass still raised in the air, his grand toast completely forgotten. Thomas reluctantly took the digital pen and signed his name on the screen. The courier handed over the thick, heavy envelope, turned around, and walked briskly down the driveway without saying another word. Thomas stood in the open doorway, staring down at the package in his hands. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the exact moment his eyes registered the return address printed in the top left corner. It was the bold, unmistakable logo of Caldwell and Associates, the legal representation for Oakwood Holdings, LLC. The Phantom Corporation had finally arrived at their doorstep, and it had brought the absolute truth right into the middle of their perfect party. Thomas stood frozen in the open doorway, holding the thick white envelope as if it were a live, explosive device. The cold outside air drifted into the warm dining room, but nobody moved to close the door. Aunt Patricia was still holding her phone high, her live video broadcast capturing every agonizing second of the heavy silence. The festive atmosphere of the Sunday brunch had completely evaporated, replaced by a dense, suffocating tension that wrapped around the throats of every guest in the room. Linda finally stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the front door shut, cutting off the outside world. She turned to my father with a strained, nervous smile plastered across her face. She loudly declared to the silent room that it was probably just some boring administrative paperwork regarding the final closing details of their lucrative house sale. She practically ordered Thomas to open the package and get it over with so they could return to celebrating Blake's magnificent future. She laughed, a high-pitched artificial sound that failed to put anyone at ease. Thomas did not look convinced, but he obediently carried the heavy envelope toward the center of the large mahogany dining table. He set his half-empty champagne flute down next to a silver platter of imported pastries and expensive smoked salmon. The wealthy guests instinctively took a collective step back, giving him space, but keeping their eyes glued to the package. Blake descended the final few stairs, his arrogant posture replaced by a rigid defensive stance. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, watching his father slide a silver letter opener under the reinforced flap of the certified mailer. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet room. Thomas reached inside and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. The cover letter was printed on the official heavy cardstock of Caldwell and Associates. I watched through the live digital feed on my hotel balcony as my father's hands began to tremble slightly. He cleared his throat, adjusting his posture, trying to regain his commanding patriarchal presence in front of his high society country club peers. He looked down at the first document and began to read the bold black text out loud. His voice started off strong but immediately cracked as his brain processed the first few lines of complex legal jargon. He read the header, which clearly stated it was a formal notice of lease violation. Linda let out a sharp, nervous gasp, completely confused by the terminology. She interrupted him, stating that there must be some kind of ridiculous mistake because proud property owners do not receive lease violations. She told the wealthy guests that the downtown law firm had obviously mixed up their file with someone else. She insisted that they were the absolute masters of their domain, and this was just a pathetic clerical error from an incompetent secretary. But Thomas held up his hand, demanding absolute silence. The thick paper in his hand was shaking so badly, it made a continuous quiet rustling sound. He continued reading the document out loud, his face draining of color with every single word. The legal notice explicitly stated that the current occupants of the property, Thomas and Linda, were in direct material violation of their private residential occupancy agreement. The document detailed that the occupants had engaged in the unauthorized subleasing of the premises for financial gain. Thomas stumbled over the next sentence, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. The legal text specifically named me. It stated that the occupants had unlawfully extorted $2,000 per month in unapproved rent from Vanessa. Aunt Patricia gasped loudly, dropping her phone slightly though the camera kept rolling, broadcasting the spectacular disaster to her entire social network. The guests exchanged shocked, highly uncomfortable glances. They had all been told the elaborate malicious lie that I had drained my parents' retirement accounts and cruelly abandoned them out of petty jealousy. Now they were hearing an official binding legal document state that my parents had been illegally charging me exorbitant rent to sleep in my own childhood bedroom. Linda lunged forward, trying to snatch the paper from my father's hands. She shrieked that the document was a complete fabrication and a vicious, malicious attack on their pristine good name. But Thomas pulled the paper out of her reach, his eyes wide with rising panic. He moved the first page to the back of the stack, revealing the second document. The second document featured a bold red header that commanded immediate, terrifying attention. Thomas stared at the text, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He began reading the second document out loud to the silent, horrified room. It was a formal cease and desist order, directly addressing the attempted unauthorized sale of the property. The legal language was sharp, brutal, and absolutely unforgiving. It explicitly named the flashy luxury real estate broker Marcus Vance, who had been proudly parading through the house just days before. The document ordered Thomas and Linda to immediately halt all marketing campaigns, public listing showings, and attempts to sell the estate. Thomas read the specific penalty clause that stated the occupants possessed absolutely zero legal authority, zero financial equity, and zero ownership rights to the property located at that exact address. The document confirmed in plain, unforgiving English that Thomas and Linda were nothing more than heavily subsidized tenants living under a strictly controlled private rental agreement. The collective gasp from the wealthy friends and extended family members was deafening. The grand suburban illusion was completely shattered in a matter of seconds. The people in that dining room had just spent the last 2 hours listening to Linda brag endlessly about her massive impending real estate windfall. They had just raised their expensive crystal glasses to toast my parents' incredible financial sacrifice for their golden child. Now they were standing in the middle of the dining room, realizing that the people throwing this lavish party did not even own the walls surrounding them. Uncle Greg took a large step backward, looking at my father as if he were a complete stranger. The entire foundation of respect, based on perceived wealth, evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but pure social disgust. Blake stood frozen, his face contorting into a mask of pure terror, as he realized his $50,000 seed money and his imaginary restaurant empire were built on a foundation of absolute lies. The house was not theirs to sell. There was no massive equity to draw from. There was no magical financial safety net to catch his inevitable failures. Linda was hyperventilating now. She grabbed the edge of the dining table, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging fiercely into the dark wood. She screamed at Thomas, demanding to know who was doing this to them. She shrieked that Oakwood Holdings LLC was supposed to be a highly generous private lender who had saved them from total bankruptcy 5 years ago. She demanded to know who was hiding behind the faceless corporate entity that was suddenly destroying their lives and humiliating them in front of their esteemed guests. Thomas did not answer her immediately. His hands were shaking so violently that the thick stack of papers rattled loudly against each other. He slowly pulled the third and final document from the back of the heavy stack. It was a certified, notarized copy of the official county property deed. The document proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Oakwood Holdings LLC was the sole undisputed owner of the sprawling brick colonial house and the 2 acres of manicured land it sat upon. Thomas scanned the dense legal text, searching desperately for a name, a signature, a point of contact, anything that would explain who held their entire existence in the palm of their hands. He desperately needed to know the identity of the person who possessed the ultimate power to evict them and ruin their lives. He flipped to the final signature page of the deed, where the corporate registration details were explicitly and legally listed. He stared at the bottom of the page, and his entire body went completely rigid. He stopped breathing entirely. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. Linda slammed her open hand on the dining table, demanding that he read the name. She yelled at him at the top of her lungs to tell her who was managing the evil corporation that was trying to ruin her perfect family. Thomas slowly lifted his heavy head and looked directly at his furious wife. His eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying mixture of absolute shock and profound, crushing realization. He looked over at Blake, who was staring back with wide, panicked eyes, his arrogant entitlement entirely erased by the impending reality of poverty. Then Thomas looked out at the silent crowd of wealthy friends and judgmental relatives who were hanging on his every single breath, waiting for the final devastating piece of the puzzle. He lowered his eyes back to the heavy premium paper in his trembling hands. He swallowed hard, trying to find the moisture to speak. His voice was nothing more than a hollow, broken whisper when he finally read the last line out loud. He read the official title of the sole managing director and the sole financial backer of Oakwood Holdings, LLC. He read my name, Vanessa. The name hung in the air like a physical weight. Vanessa. The single word completely decimated the carefully constructed reality of everyone standing in that sprawling dining room. Aunt Patricia slowly lowered her phone. The live video broadcast she had been so eagerly recording was abruptly terminated. The screen went dark, but the massive damage was already permanently etched into the digital universe. Patricia stared at her sister with an expression of profound disgust and absolute horror. The complex puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together in Patricia's mind. The elaborate, tearful story Linda had spun about me draining their retirement accounts was a complete fabrication. The tragic tale of a cruel corporate daughter abandoning her elderly parents was a desperate, malicious lie designed to cover up a monumental financial humiliation. I was not the villain of this story. I was the secret, silent landlord who had been keeping a roof over their heads for half a decade. Uncle Greg placed his half-eaten pastry on the nearest table and wiped his hands on a linen napkin, as if he suddenly needed to wash himself clean of my parents' toxicity. He looked at Thomas with pure, unadulterated pity, mixed with a heavy dose of anger. In their affluent country club circles, financial ruin was a tragedy, but lying to your own family about it to solicit emergency loans was an unforgivable sin. The wealthy neighborhood friends who had been cheering for Blake just moments before began quietly shuffling toward the front door. There were no polite goodbyes or promises to stay in touch. They grabbed their expensive coats and hurried out of the house, treating my parents like they were highly contagious. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family caught in the middle of a catastrophic public eviction scandal. Linda let out a strange, high-pitched wail. She lunged forward and snatched the heavy property deed directly out of Thomas' hand. Her manicured fingers traced the ink on the premium paper, searching desperately for any sign of a typo or a legal loophole. She refused to accept the cold, hard reality staring her right in the face. She started screaming that the document had to be a fake, a vindictive prank orchestrated by a jealous daughter. But nobody in the room was buying her desperate performance anymore. The embossed corporate seal of Caldwell and Associates was undeniable. The legal authority of the documents was absolute. Aunt Patricia stepped forward, her face flushed with righteous anger. She demanded to know the entire truth. She asked Linda directly if she had known that the house belonged to Oakwood Holdings, LLC all along. Linda stumbled over her words, completely unable to formulate a coherent lie under the intense, crushing pressure of her sister's glare. Thomas finally found his voice, but it was weak and completely defeated. He admitted to Patricia that they had signed a private occupancy agreement 5 years ago when his business went bankrupt. He confessed that they had been paying a heavily subsidized monthly rate to what they believed was a private lending firm. He admitted that they had absolutely no equity in the property and zero legal right to sell it. Blake backed away from the group, retreating until his spine hit the wall near the grand staircase. His tailored linen blazer suddenly looked ridiculous. The $50,000 he had proudly secured from his parents was now completely tainted. It was not seed money from wealthy investors. It was cash forcefully extorted from the actual owner of the house, combined with the very funds meant to keep them from being evicted. Blake's grand imaginary restaurant empire evaporated into thin air. He was a 35-year-old unemployed man living in a basement that belonged exclusively to the sister he had actively relentlessly mocked. The crushing weight of his own profound failure settled heavily on his shoulders. He realized he was entirely at my mercy, and that he had spent the last 4 weeks deliberately antagonizing the only person holding the keys to his luxurious lifestyle. Patricia did not offer any sympathy or comfort to my sobbing mother. Instead, she delivered a final devastating blow. She told Linda that she was deeply ashamed to call her a sister. She stated that weaponizing the extended family against the very daughter who had secretly saved them from homelessness was the most despicable, vile act she could possibly imagine. Patricia turned on her heel, grabbed Uncle Greg by the arm, and marched out the front door without looking back. The remaining family members quickly followed suit, abandoning my parents to the cold, harsh reality of their massive empty house. They were completely alone, surrounded by half-empty champagne flutes and the undeniable proof of their own spectacular ruin. Later that exact same night, I sat outside on the expansive private balcony of my newly finished city condo. The structural renovations were completely done, and the space was an absolute masterpiece of modern design. I rested my bare feet against the cool glass railing and looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline. The city below was alive with movement and energy, but up on the 20th floor, I was enveloped in total, complete peace. A gentle breeze blew in from the lake, carrying the crisp, clean scent of autumn. I held a glass of expensive reserve wine in my right hand, gently swirling the dark red liquid and savoring the quiet victory of the moment. My living room behind me was perfectly organized, smelling of fresh paint, new hardwood floors, and absolute freedom. My phone sat face up on the small wrought iron patio table next to me. The bright screen was illuminating the dark space with a relentless, frantic energy. The digital notifications were stacking up so quickly that the device was practically vibrating off the metal surface. The fallout from the disastrous Sunday brunch had officially reached its peak, and my family was currently experiencing a massive collective meltdown. I did not mute the device. I wanted to see every single desperate attempt they made to contact me. I wanted to witness the full spectrum of their panic as they realized the catastrophic magnitude of their fatal mistake. I watched the screen light up with 24 missed calls from Linda. My mother was completely spiraling. I could easily picture her pacing back and forth across the hardwood floors of my property, clutching her phone with trembling hands and crying perfectly manufactured tears. She left several lengthy voicemails, each one increasingly hysterical. I tapped the screen and listened to them purely for the psychological closure. In the first voicemail, she tried to play the role of the wounded, confused matriarch. She sobbed into the receiver, claiming that there had been a terrible, massive misunderstanding and begging me to come back to the suburbs so we could work things out like a loving family. When I did not respond, her subsequent voicemails rapidly shifted in tone. She transitioned from playing the victim to attempting aggressive emotional manipulation. She reminded me that she had given birth to me, that she had sacrificed her best years to raise me, and that a good daughter would never subject her elderly parents to such a brutal public humiliation. She claimed her blood pressure was dangerously high, and that if she suffered a major medical emergency, it would be entirely on my conscience. By the final voicemail, she was simply screaming into the phone, demanding that I answer her calls and threatening to hire a massive team of high-powered lawyers to rip the property deed away from my greedy hands. Her threats were entirely empty, and we both knew it perfectly well. Thomas was not faring any better. The screen displayed 15 missed calls from my father. His voicemails were a masterclass in defeated patriarchal desperation. He started off trying to use his booming, authoritative voice, commanding me to pick up the phone and stop playing ridiculous legal games. He ordered me to transfer the deed into a family trust, immediately stating that Oakwood Holdings was a blatant betrayal of their trust. But as the hours ticked by, and the reality of his impending eviction set in, his tone completely fractured. His final message was a pathetic, broken plea. He admitted that his reputation was completely destroyed, that his wealthy friends had blocked his number, and that he had absolutely no idea how he was going to survive this financial apocalypse. He actually begged me not to throw them out onto the street. He promised he would get a job, sell his cars, and do whatever it took to make things right. The man who had sternly ordered me to pay $2,000 a month for a twin bed was now practically on his knees begging for my corporate mercy. Then came the text messages from Blake. My 35-year-old brother sent a rapid-fire barrage of frantic misspelled messages. He was in a state of absolute total panic. His first few texts were aggressive, demanding to know what the hell I was doing and calling me a sociopath for ruining his restaurant launch party. He accused me of being insanely jealous of his culinary talent and deliberately orchestrating this legal disaster just to watch him fail. But reality comes at you fast when you have $0 in your bank account and an eviction notice looming over your head. His later messages shifted into pure pathetic begging. He asked if he was getting kicked out of the basement suite. He pleaded with me to let him stay, claiming he had absolutely nowhere else to go and no money to rent an apartment. He swore he would start paying rent, he would clean the house, he would even cook meals for me if I just let him keep his luxury setup. The golden child was finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world, and he was completely terrified. He realized that the $50,000 he had happily taken from my extorted rent money was not going to protect him from the concrete legal power of Oakwood Holdings, LLC. He was a tenant without a lease living in a house owned by the woman he had relentlessly abused. I sat on my balcony and finished the last sip of my red wine. The cool Chicago air felt refreshing against my skin. I looked at the phone as it lit up with yet another desperate incoming call from my mother. The screen flashed brightly in the darkness, illuminating the sleek, modern furniture of my beautiful new home. I did not feel an ounce of pity or guilt. They had dug this massive grave entirely by themselves, using their greed, their entitlement, and their overwhelming arrogance as the shovels. I was simply the one who had finally stopped filling it back in for them. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. I swiped away the incoming call, sending my mother directly to voicemail for the 25th time that night. I did not intend to answer a single phone call from any of them. Listening to their panic was satisfying, but engaging in a chaotic, emotional shouting match over the phone was entirely beneath me. I needed to establish firm, absolute control over the next phase of this process. I opened the main family group chat, which had been completely dead since Aunt Patricia left the brunch in disgust. I placed my fingers on the digital keyboard and typed out a single brief message. I did not offer any explanations, any apologies, or any emotional responses to their endless barrage of frantic communication. I simply sent one text to the family group chat. I will see you at my lawyer's office on Monday at 9 in the morning. Do not be late. I hit send, powered down the device, and walked back inside my perfect, peaceful home. Monday morning arrived with unrelenting clarity. I sat at the head of the expansive mahogany conference table in Mr. Caldwell's downtown office, perfectly composed. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open and my family was ushered into the room. The visual contrast between us was staggering. I wore a tailored navy blue power suit exuding the quiet absolute authority of a woman who held every single card. Thomas, Linda, and Blake looked like they had barely survived a natural disaster. Their clothes were wrinkled and dark circles bruised the delicate skin under my mother's eyes. My father's usual arrogant swagger had been entirely replaced by a nervous, jittery energy. Blake dragged his feet as he walked in looking like a terrified child who was about to be severely disciplined. They sat across from me in a row of 3 leather chairs, looking small and incredibly fragile in the vast corporate boardroom. Mr. Caldwell sat to my right, an open folder of legally binding documents resting neatly on the table in front of him. For a long, unbroken minute, nobody spoke a single word. I simply watched them, letting the crushing weight of the sterile corporate environment press down on their suburban sensibilities. This was my arena, and they knew it. My mother was the first to break the heavy silence. She started exactly the way she always did, by playing the ultimate victim. Linda buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, dramatic sob. She wailed that I had ruthlessly deceived my own flesh and blood for 5 long years. She accused me of being a manipulative sociopath who had deliberately tricked her aging parents into feeling safe just so I could violently rip the rug out from under them. She cried that the public humiliation of the Sunday brunch had completely destroyed her social standing, and her closest friends were now refusing to return her phone calls. She reached across the wide table with trembling hands begging me to end this cruel, horrible prank. She said she knew I was just acting out because I was jealous of Blake, but that I had taken the joke entirely too far. Then, with a level of staggering entitlement that defied human comprehension, she made her grand demand. She wiped her tears, smoothed the front of her designer blouse, and told me that a good, loyal daughter would immediately fix this embarrassing misunderstanding. She demanded that I instruct my lawyer to legally transfer the property deed from Oakwood Holdings directly into her and my father's names to atone for the massive emotional trauma I had inflicted upon the family. I stared at her, letting her absurd demand hang in the cold air. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of sympathy. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and asked her why on earth I would give a multi-million-dollar property to a woman who had just violently kicked me out onto the street. Linda recoiled as if she had been physically slapped. She sputtered, attempting to spin another web of emotional manipulation, but she was completely out of her depth. That was when my father decided to intervene. Thomas slammed his fist down hard on the mahogany table, an aggressive, desperate attempt to reclaim his lost patriarchal authority. He pointed a thick finger at my face and barked that he was still the head of the family. He declared loudly that families do not play dirty legal games with each other, and they certainly do not use ruthless corporate lawyers to intimidate their own parents. He commanded me to immediately dissolve the limited liability company and sign the deed over to him today. He said my money belonged to the family and keeping secrets from him was a fundamental breach of respect. He tried to rationalize his absolute failure by stating that he was a proud man who had simply hit a streak of bad luck 5 years ago. He claimed that if he had known his own daughter was the one holding the mortgage, he would never have allowed it because it completely undermined his position as the provider. He actually tried to frame my secret financial rescue as a malicious attack on his fragile ego. He demanded that I stop acting like a ruthless corporate tyrant and start acting like an obedient, respectful daughter, telling me to dismiss Mr. Caldwell from the room so we could handle this quietly. Mr. Caldwell did not move a single muscle. He simply looked at me, waiting for my instruction. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished wood of the conference table. I looked at the 3 desperate people sitting across from me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating clarity. I told my father that his position as the family provider had officially ended 5 years ago, on the exact day his business went bankrupt. I told him I was not playing a dirty legal game. I was simply enforcing the boundaries of a financial rescue mission that they had actively abused. Then I methodically began to lay out the cold, hard, indisputable math. I wanted them to hear every single dollar and cent, so there could be absolutely no confusion about the magnitude of their spectacular failure. I opened my own folder and slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. I told them that 5 years ago, I spent $900,000 in pure cash to save them from being publicly dragged out of their house by the county sheriff. I explained that for 60 consecutive months, I had charged them a highly subsidized rent of $2,000. I detailed the fair market rental value of their luxury suburban estate, proving I had willingly absorbed a $4,000 monthly loss just so they could comfortably maintain their grand illusion of wealth. I pointed out that over 5 years, my silent, hidden charity had cost me exactly $240,000 in lost rental income. I watched the color completely drain from my father's face as he stared at the staggering numbers printed on the spreadsheet. The reality of my massive, ongoing financial sacrifice was finally piercing his thick wall of arrogance. I turned my attention to the $2,000 they had aggressively extorted from me when I moved into my childhood bedroom. I asked my mother to explain the exact logic behind charging her silent benefactor $2,000 a month for a twin bed. I asked her how she could possibly justify demanding rent from the exact person who was quietly keeping her out of a cheap, cramped apartment. Linda opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. She was completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of her own greed. I shifted my gaze to Blake, who was actively trying to sink lower into his leather chair. I pointed directly at my 35-year-old unemployed brother. I told my parents that the absolute most unforgivable part of their betrayal was not the extortion itself. The most unforgivable part was what they did with my money. I explained that they had taken the massive monthly savings I secretly provided them, hoarded it into a private account, and combined it with the rent they squeezed out of me. I told them I knew exactly where that $50,000 had gone. They had taken my hard-earned corporate salary and handed it directly to a man who actively, relentlessly mocked me. They had used my money to fund the golden child inside a house that I bought and paid for. I asked them if demanding money from their savior to fund a parasite was their definition of unconditional love. My father stared blankly at the polished table, unable to formulate a single defense. My mother let out a quiet, broken whimper, finally realizing there was no emotional manipulation powerful enough to erase the stark reality of the financial ledger. Blake just stared at his expensive shoes, looking completely terrified. I told them they had fundamentally misunderstood our entire relationship. They thought they held the power because they controlled the social narrative. They thought they could treat me like a reliable, disposable asset, while showering Blake with endless unearned rewards. But the reality was that I held the deed. I held the leverage. I held the absolute power to dismantle their entire suburban existence. I told them they had forcefully kicked their generous landlord out into the street because they were too blinded by their own toxic favoritism to see the truth. They had thrown away a lifetime of secure, subsidized housing just to satisfy their arrogant greed. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat, bringing the focus back to the strict legal proceedings. The reality check was completely over, and the harsh, undeniable truth had been permanently established. They were no longer speaking to their obedient daughter. They were sitting across from the managing director of Oakwood Holdings, LLC, and it was time to issue the final, devastating terms of their future survival. I opened the thick, black leather portfolio resting on the table in front of me. The crisp sound of the heavy paper sliding against the polished wood echoed in the quiet boardroom. I pulled out two distinct documents, each printed on premium white cardstock with the official Oakwood Holdings, LLC letterhead emblazoned across the top. I did not rush this moment. I took my time, ensuring they fully understood that every single movement I made was deliberate and irreversible. I slid the first document smoothly across the table, stopping it directly in front of Blake. My brother stared down at the paper, his face completely devoid of its usual arrogant color. I told Blake to read the top line carefully. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he focused on the bold black text. I informed him that the document was a formal legal 30-day notice of eviction. I explained to my parents that Blake was not currently listed on any official occupancy agreement, nor had he ever been authorized to reside on the premises managed by Oakwood Holdings. For 2 years, he had been illegally occupying the property, effectively functioning as an unauthorized squatter. I looked directly into Blake's terrified eyes and told him that his free ride was officially over. I stated that I absolutely refused to continue subsidizing the luxurious lifestyle of a 35-year-old man who actively mocked the very person keeping a roof over his head. I told him he had exactly 30 days to pack up his expensive kitchen equipment, his massive television, and his inflated ego and vacate the basement suite permanently. Linda immediately let out a sharp, frantic gasp. She reached out and grabbed Blake's arm as if physically trying to protect him from the legal document. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and pleaded with me not to do this. She argued that the basement was Blake's home, that he needed a safe, stable environment to properly develop his entrepreneurial ventures. She claimed that throwing him out onto the street would completely destroy his fragile creative spirit and ruin any chance he had at becoming a successful restaurateur. She begged me to show some familial compassion, stating that a sister should unconditionally support her brother, especially during his most vulnerable transitional phases. I did not blink. I told my mother that her definition of unconditional support was exactly what had crippled him. I explained that she had spent decades actively enabling his laziness, shielding him from the very consequences that force a person to grow up. I reminded her that my idea of familial compassion was spending $900,000 to save my parents from public ruin, while her idea of compassion was demanding $2,000 from her daughter to fund her son's endless delusions. I stated firmly that the eviction notice was completely non-negotiable. If Blake was truly the brilliant, resilient entrepreneur they claimed he would have absolutely no problem securing a commercial lease and funding his own lifestyle. I then pulled the second document from the portfolio and slid it precisely to the center of the table, stopping it halfway between Linda and Thomas. I watched my father's eyes immediately drop to the paper, expecting another devastating blow to his already shattered pride. I told them that the document was a brand new, strictly legally binding lease agreement for the suburban property. I stated that they were permitted to remain in the house, but the financial rules of engagement had been fundamentally, permanently altered. I explained that the previous highly subsidized rental rate of $2,000 a month was officially terminated. I reminded them that they had actively chosen to violate the terms of that generous arrangement when they illegally extorted rent from me to fund Blake. I told them that the new lease agreement reflected the exact fair market rental value for a sprawling 2-acre luxury estate in their specific, highly desirable zip code. I pointed to the bold number printed clearly on the second page of the contract. The new monthly rent was exactly $6,000. Thomas let out a harsh, strangled breath. He stared at the number as if it were written in a foreign language. He looked up at me, his face a mask of pure defeated panic. He stammered that they could not possibly afford $6,000 a month. He admitted that their savings were completely drained entirely by the $50,000 seed money they had handed to Blake and the subsequent expensive parties they had hosted in the basement. He confessed that he was barely managing to make the minimum payments on their maxed-out credit cards. He pleaded with me, stating that a $6,000 monthly burden would rapidly force them into total absolute bankruptcy within a matter of months. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms smoothly over my chest. I told my father that their current financial insolvency was a tragedy entirely of their own making. I reminded him that just a few short weeks ago, they had proudly possessed $48,000 in hoarded savings, a direct result of my silent, ongoing charity. I pointed out that if they had simply appreciated the massive housing subsidy I provided them instead of forcefully squeezing me for more money, they would still have that crucial financial safety net. I stated that their desperate decision to aggressively fund Blake's imaginary restaurant had ultimately sealed their own fate. I made the final terms absolutely crystal clear. I told them they had a very simple choice to make today. They could sign the new lease agreement right now, committing to the $6,000 monthly payment and figuring out how to survive in the reality they had created. Or they could refuse to sign. If they chose to refuse, I instructed Mr. Caldwell to immediately issue a formal 30-day eviction notice for the entire property. They would all be forced to vacate the premises entirely, and I would list the house on the open real estate market the very next day. I set my expensive fountain pen down on top of the lease agreement. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to decide if they wanted to remain in their beloved suburban castle or start packing their bags. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a carefully constructed decades-old illusion finally collapsing under the crushing weight of undeniable truth. Linda buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly into her palms. She realized that she could no longer manipulate the situation with tears or aggressive guilt trips. She had absolutely no leverage left. Thomas stared at the heavy gold pen resting on the document, his chest heaving with slow, labored breaths. He knew that refusing to sign meant facing the ultimate public humiliation he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. If they were evicted, their wealthy country club friends and the entire extended family would watch them drag their belongings out to the curb. Their reputation would be completely permanently annihilated. Blake sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the eviction notice still sitting in front of him. He did not offer to help his parents. He did not suggest that he could get a job to help cover the new exorbitant rent. He simply retreated inward, entirely consumed by his own impending doom. The golden child had been completely neutralized, his protective shield entirely removed. Thomas slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the gold pen. He did not look at me. He could not bring himself to meet the eyes of the daughter he had consistently belittled and mocked. He simply looked down at the signature line, gripping the pen so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. With jerky, uneven strokes, he signed his name on the designated line, legally binding himself to the crushing new reality of their existence. He slid the document over to Linda, who blindly signed her name through her tears, completely surrendering to the harsh, unyielding terms of the new agreement. They were utterly defeated. They had walked into the boardroom clinging to a shred of their former arrogance, hoping to somehow bully or guilt me into compliance. They were leaving the boardroom completely stripped of their illusions, facing a terrifying financial future, and forced to finally kick their beloved parasite out into the cold, hard reality of the real world. I watched Mr. Caldwell collect the signed documents, verifying the signatures with practiced professional efficiency. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply forced them to live in the exact world they had so aggressively demanded to control. I stood up from the conference table, buttoning my suit jacket with a sharp, decisive movement. I looked down at the three shattered people sitting before me. I did not offer any parting words of comfort or any false promises of future reconciliation. I simply told them that the first month's rent of $6,000 was due exactly on the first of the month, and that Oakwood Holdings did not offer any grace periods for late payments. I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them alone in the quiet, sterile space to fully absorb the catastrophic consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. The heavy glass doors of the law firm closed behind me with a soft, definitive click, severing my physical connection to their frantic panic. I stepped out onto the bustling Chicago street and hailed a cab, my mind already shifting back to my own life. I did not look back up at the towering skyscraper. The ruthless legal machinery was now fully in motion, and it required absolutely no further emotional investment from me. For Blake, the devastating reality of his 30-day eviction notice hit with the brutal force of a physical impact. He had spent his entire adult life insulated from the harsh consequences of the real world, entirely protected by my parents' endless financial buffering. Now that shield was completely annihilated. Without my secret monthly subsidy keeping the household afloat, my parents could not offer him a single dime to ease his transition. Thomas and Linda were scrambling desperately just to gather the exorbitant $6,000 they now owed me. Blake was entirely on his own for the first time in 35 years. His highly anticipated departure from the luxury basement suite was an absolute pathetic spectacle. There were no professional movers or organized packing routines. He was forced to sell his expensive professional kitchen equipment, the very tools he claimed would launch his restaurant empire, just to secure enough liquid cash for a basic security deposit. I received comprehensive updates from the neighborhood security logs, showing him dragging trash bags full of designer clothes out to a cheap rented moving van. The pristine leased Porsche was quietly repossessed by the dealership a week later because my father simply could not make the massive monthly payments anymore. Blake's grand culinary dreams evaporated into nothingness overnight. He quickly discovered that the modern housing market does not care about visionary supper club concepts or disruptive hospitality brands. Landlords only care about verifiable income and credit scores, two things Blake severely lacked. He was ultimately forced to move into a cramped, run-down apartment on the far outskirts of the city. He had to sign a lease with three other random roommates, who were all a decade younger than him. To meet his basic portion of the rent, the former aspiring restaurant mogul was brutally forced to accept a grueling entry-level job working the graveyard shift at a local distribution warehouse. The golden child was finally experiencing the exhausting, back-breaking reality of minimum wage labor, effectively ending his delusions of grandeur. While Blake was adjusting to his harsh new existence, my parents were experiencing a complete and utter social apocalypse. Aunt Patricia had practically run out of the Sunday brunch with her phone still clutched in her hand, and she wasted absolutely no time broadcasting the spectacular truth to the entire extended family network. The shocking revelation that Thomas and Linda had been secretly living in a house owned by their despised daughter spread like wildfire. The detailed story of how they had illegally extorted rent from their silent benefactor to fund their lazy son became the ultimate suburban legend. The extended relatives who had previously judged me based on my mother's malicious lies were profoundly horrified by the actual truth. They realized the staggering magnitude of the deception my parents had woven. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who used to eagerly attend my mother's lavish holiday parties completely distanced themselves. Group chats went entirely silent. Invitations to family gatherings simply stopped arriving. My parents had weaponized the family against me, and now that very same weapon had turned entirely against them, isolating them in a cold, unforgiving quarantine. Their carefully crafted social image within their wealthy, affluent neighborhood suffered an even more brutal execution. The country club friends who had bolted from the brunch did not keep the dramatic secret to themselves. The neighborhood gossip mill churned with absolute vicious efficiency. The women in Linda's exclusive bridge club quickly found excuses to cancel their weekly meetings at her house. Thomas found himself completely shunned on the golf course by men who previously respected his fabricated business acumen. Their peers did not just distance themselves because my parents were secretly broke. They distanced themselves because my parents were exposed as desperate, malicious frauds who had attempted to steal from their own child to maintain a pathetic illusion. The crushing financial reality of their new $6,000 monthly rent payment forced Thomas and Linda into a state of perpetual, exhausting survival mode. They could no longer hide behind the comfort of my secret charity. To prevent their own immediate eviction, Thomas had to swallow his massive toxic pride and beg his former business contacts for entry-level consulting contracts. He was forced to work grueling 60-hour weeks well into his late 60s just to keep their heads above water. Linda had to cancel every single luxury service she had previously enjoyed. There were no more professional landscaping crews, no more imported catering services, and no more expensive salon appointments. She was forced to manually maintain the massive 2-acre estate by herself, a constant, exhausting physical reminder of the exorbitant price tag attached to her beloved suburban castle. 1 year later, the dust had completely settled, leaving behind a starkly different reality. I sat on the expansive balcony of my beautifully renovated city condo, watching the early morning sunlight reflect off the calm waters of Lake Michigan. My supply chain consulting firm had secured 3 massive new international contracts that year, elevating my career to entirely new heights. I was thriving professionally, emotionally, and financially. My home was a perfect, peaceful sanctuary filled with carefully chosen art and the quiet comfort of absolute independence. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure banking portal for Oakwood Holdings LLC. It was the first day of the month. I navigated to the transaction history and watched as the screen automatically refreshed. A clean pending deposit of exactly $6,000 appeared at the top of the ledger. The transfer had been initiated automatically from Thomas and Linda's joint checking account. They had not missed a single payment in 12 months. They knew with absolute certainty that Mr. Caldwell would issue an immediate eviction notice the very second a transfer failed to clear. They were living in a constant state of rigid financial compliance, permanently trapped by the unyielding terms of the lease they had signed. I closed the laptop and took a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air. Over the past year, I had maintained a cold, distant peace with my parents. There were no explosive arguments, no dramatic phone calls, and absolutely no emotional confrontations. They occasionally sent sterile, brief emails to the Oakwood Holdings legal department regarding basic property maintenance issues, and Mr. Caldwell handled them with strict professional detachment. We did not exchange birthday greetings or holiday cards. The toxic cycle of seeking their approval and enduring their abuse had been entirely permanently severed. Some of my colleagues who only knew the vague outlines of my family estrangement occasionally asked if I ever planned to forgive them and seek a traditional reconciliation. They assumed that true healing required a tearful reunion and a mutual exchange of apologies. But I knew better. I had learned through the brutal crucible of their betrayal that true power does not come from forcing a toxic person to apologize. True power does not come from screaming until they finally admit they were wrong. People like Thomas and Linda are fundamentally incapable of genuine remorse because their entire identities are constructed upon thick layers of arrogant self-deception. I realized that the ultimate victory was not about extracting a meaningless apology. It was about meticulously, systematically stripping away every single illusion they used to elevate themselves. It was about removing the secret safety net and forcing them to live entirely within the harsh, unforgiving reality they had actively created. They had chosen to worship status over love. They had chosen to prioritize an entitled parasite over a devoted daughter. Now they were forced to pay the exact market price for those terrible choices every single month. I did not hate them anymore. Hate requires a level of active emotional investment that I was completely unwilling to provide. I viewed them simply as reliable long-term tenants who happened to share my DNA. They were funding my investment portfolio, while simultaneously serving a life sentence inside the very suburban prison they had fought so viciously to maintain. I picked up my warm coffee mug and walked slowly back inside my beautiful, quiet home, looking around at the space I built. The heavy burden I had carried since childhood, the constant, desperate need to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me, was completely gone. I had not just survived their spectacular cruelty, I had monetized it. I had engineered a flawless, inescapable system of accountability that required absolutely zero emotional effort on my part. The game they had played for decades was finally permanently over. They had demanded $2,000 to let me sleep in my own childhood bedroom, and in response, I had quietly, ruthlessly bought their entire world. Now I was simply enjoying the endless, beautiful silence of my own absolute, well-earned success. Looking back at the entire ordeal, the most profound lesson I learned wasn't about real estate blind trusts or financial leverage. It was about the true cost of toxic family loyalty and the liberating power of walking away. For years, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, gave enough, and sacrificed enough, my parents would finally see my worth. I thought keeping them safe from their own financial ruin would earn me a place of respect. But what I discovered is that people who build their identities on illusions will never appreciate the reality of your sacrifices. They will only view your success as a resource to be exploited and your boundaries as a threat to their control. True power isn't found in screaming matches, tearful confrontations, or forcing someone to apologize. True power is stripping away the facade and forcing them to live in the reality they actively created. I didn't need to destroy my family. I simply had to stop catching them when they deliberately jumped. We are often conditioned to believe that blood obligations trump our own well-being. But setting a boundary, even a harsh legal one, is sometimes the only way to protect your peace. You do not owe your sanity, your savings, or your hard-earned success to people who treat you as an ATM while offering their unconditional love to an entitled parasite. You are allowed to close the door, change the locks, and build a beautiful, quiet life entirely on your own terms. If you are watching this and you have been the scapegoat in your own family, stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a toxic relative to protect your own peace and financial security? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, Please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and defining your own success. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply a well-lived life.